Hey everyone, and welcome to our Encore virtual book club with Madeline Miller. For those of you who missed our first event, Madeline is the author of the award-winning book The Song of Achilles and the bestseller Circe, both which are fantastic adaptations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Since our first event focused on Circe, today we're going to take an in-depth look at the Song of Achilles. So please feel free to leave your questions in the comment section below our video, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during our Q&A portion of the event. Madeline, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me again.
So, as I mentioned to our audience, the last time you visited our program, you were part of our programming, we discussed Circe, which is also now available in paperback for all of the interested listeners. But this event, we're focusing on your first work, the award-winning novel, The Song of Achilles, which you guys can see right here behind me. What's the inspiration behind the title of this book, The Song of Achilles? Because I think we're used to hearing about Achilles being angry, or Achilles fighting the Trojans, or his bitter disputes with Agamemnon. But I don't think song is necessarily the word that I would associate with Achilles.
Yes. Well, so I'm going to start by revealing that I'm was very, very anxious about titling this book. And I really didn't know. I had named it, like, the Word document in my computer for it was, Patroclus book. And then sometimes I would change it to Achilles book, depending. But at some point I started thinking that maybe I wanted to name it something like In the Armor of Achilles, something like that, something referencing the famous moment in the Iliad where Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor, but obviously it also has sort of larger resonance. But it just didn't feel right. It never felt right, even when I was sort of thinking about that as the title. And then another book came out that was called, I think, the Achilles' Armor or something like that. Anyway, that was the end of that. So I definitely had to come up with a new title, which was a great thing because I really needed a new title. And so I started thinking, and I was trying to figure out, what's right. I wanted it to feel organic. I wanted it to feel resonant. And what happens when I get stuck like that is I always go back to the original. And I started thinking about the Iliad and what the Iliad meant. And of course, what the Iliad, that word, that name means is the Song of Troy. Ili is Troy, and ad is the word for song. It's where we get the English word ode. And so the Iliad means the Song of Troy, and all these poems were sung and performed. And so immediately I start thinking of songs. And that makes a lot of sense with Achilles, because although we remember Achilles as sort of, the murderer and the rage-filled and the prideful, all of those things, he is a beautiful singer in the Iliad. And there's actually a scene in the Iliad where he beautifully sings and plays the lyre. And that was part of, Achilles that I wanted to be bringing out throughout the novel, is the fact that, he ended up choosing this destiny of war, but he easily could have been another Orpheus, that he had this whole other side to him. And so the Song of Achilles suddenly just, I thought of it and there it was.
So we've already got questions streaming in from our audience, and I'm going to try and incorporate them as our conversation develops. But this question is from Mariposa Ortiz, and she obviously says she loves your books, and wants to know if you were always a novelist, and how did you get started with publication? Also, any hints or tips for novice writers? And I think that ties into the next question that I have, being that, when you did decide to take on this challenge, and this was the first book, did you expect the level of success that another, a rendition of Homer's Iliad had? And this is usually a topic that I think, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, are things you encounter in high school kind of grudgingly as a student. You're like, oh, I have to read the Odyssey, or I have to read the Iliad.
I definitely did not expect that anyone to buy it other than my close family and friends whose arms I had twisted. So, I felt like I was completely shocked. And it still remains incredibly humbling and thrilling to me that people want to read this story. But I was always a novelist, although I didn't always connect my classics and my novel writing. So when I was a child, I really wanted to be a writer. Although if you had asked me that, I would never have admitted it because it felt like hubris to say that I wanted to be a writer. But I loved writing and I loved storytelling. And I wrote and wrote and wrote so many terrible short stories, terrible drafts of novels all through high school and college. And all that was going on kind of on a parallel track, while over here I was studying classics, Homer, Latin and Greek, Achilles and Patroclus in particular. And I had been planning to write my master's thesis on interpretations of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers through the centuries. And through sort of this quirky series of events, I ended up realizing that actually I didn't want to write that as an academic paper. I wanted to write it as a novel, and that the things I wanted to say about Achilles and Patroclus, actually I wanted to say not with footnotes, but in a novel form. I wanted to make an emotional case for something as opposed to a, literary case for it. And I felt like that those two things could actually come together, that all that research I had done and all that thinking about Achilles and Patroclus could go right into the novel. And it was revelation for me when I realized that I could put together these two things that I had loved my whole life. And then it took me 10 years from that revelation, but it was still an important moment. And in terms of my advice for writers who are starting out or who are thinking about publication, I think my biggest piece of advice would be that, so-called wrong turns and bad drafts are absolutely part of the process. That I think it's easy to feel when you're starting out that, this is a terrible draft. I can't fix it. I don't know. I'm going to give up. But that all writers have those. And no one writes a great first draft, or no one I know writes a great first draft. And that those moments aren't setbacks. They're just part of the process of developing your thinking about the novel. So, moving away from that all or nothing, this is great or versus this is terrible, to the bad drafts are part of the road. And I really started thinking about getting an agent once I felt like I had gotten the story to absolutely the best place I could get it to. I had done everything I could do with it. That is when I kind of moved towards publication.
So we've gotten, obviously the questions are streaming in, so I'm going to let our audience drive the conversation a little bit. But obviously you talked about Patroclus and you talked about his relationship with Achilles. And this question is from one of our viewers, Lauren Green, who asks, why did you decide to write from the point of view of Patroclus? And was it hard finding reference points since so much of the mythology is Achilles-centric? Or was it freeing to have the space to shape Patroclus in the way that you wanted?
It was freeing. I loved it. And actually, I never considered writing from anyone else's perspective other than his. It was, Patroclus or bust. And part of what I loved about him was actually the mystery about him in the Iliad. So we're going to get into Iliad spoilers here, but given that this is a Song of Achilles book club and it's a 3,000-year-old story, hopefully you guys will forgive me. But when Patroclus dies in the Iliad and Achilles is just exploded with grief and with rage, I just kept getting stuck on that moment. And I kept reading it and thinking, the Iliad is a poem about death and grief. And yet this death, this loss stands out. And, what was their relationship? Because up to that point in the Iliad, we hear from Homer that Patroclus is the most beloved companion of Achilles, but we don't really see the two of them interacting very much. Patroclus is sort of like Achilles' shadow. He's there in the background. And then he steps forward to put on Achilles' armor and to go out. But we're really just seeing the end of their relationship. And this whole relationship, I felt, is implied by what we see as Achilles' reaction to losing Patroclus. But none of it is spelled out. And so part of what I wanted to do is, who is the man that means this much to Achilles? Achilles has been telling us through the whole Iliad, nothing matters but my reputation. I'll never fight for Agamemnon again unless he personally apologizes. But as soon as Patroclus is dead, that's gone. The only thing that actually matters to him, and matters more to him than his reputation, is Patroclus. And so it felt like a mystery to be solved. So I kind of went through all of the Iliad looking for, what are the little hints about Patroclus that I can find? And there's some real interesting things in there. So for one, we hear that when he was young, he accidentally killed another child, which I thought, wow, that's really intriguing. What an intense experience to have as a child. We hear that Achilles is not the only one who mourns over Patroclus's body. Actually, there's a beautiful speech delivered over his body by Briseis, the slave woman, the captive woman, who's sort of the point of contention between Achilles and Agamemnon. That's the conflict that kicks off the Iliad. And she says of Patroclus, as he lies dead before her, grieving, she says, "You were always gentle." And that really jumped out at me because there are a lot of words used to describe ancient Greek heroes, but gentle does not top the list. And then you have another scene where Menelaus, who's the Spartan king, fighting on the Greek side, it's his wife Helen that's been taken by the Trojans, and Patroclus has been killed, and he's trying to rally the Greeks to get Patroclus's body to bring it back to Achilles. And to rally the Greeks, he says, "Come on, all you Greeks, everyone fight for Patroclus. He was kind to everyone." And again, I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Not he sacked a lot of cities, he threw great parties, he gave out great gifts, but he was kind to everyone. And we see him also in sort of a healer capacity. So I thought, well, wow, this is a really interesting and unusual person. So that was kind of my way into him, is that he was this person who was remembered for being kind to everybody.
Could you talk a little bit about developing the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus? The way their personalities interplay is one of our viewer Michaela's favorite aspects of the book, and I think for me as well, it was really fascinating to see Achilles with this mythical aura about him, and he's almost viewed as godlike by his peers, and which comes in sharp contrast to Patroclus, like we just mentioned, who is described as gentle. And he has decidedly human flaws. At the beginning of a book, it would be safe to assume that neither of them would probably ever be friends. But this human relationship is what drives the story. Can you talk about that relationship and developing the relationship throughout the book?
Sure. So I have always, one of the things that I have always thought about Achilles when I sort of look at the Iliad is I really remember how incredibly young he is. He's younger than almost anyone else there. And I think that there is an innocence to him that goes along with that youth, this strange innocence of sort of sweetness and privilege, that kind of goes hand in hand of being the best at everything, but also this sort of, the wonderful singer, the person who's there fighting for his reputation, but has no hatred for the Trojans at all. He's this very strange mix of personality traits. And so it was that youth and that innocence that I think I focused on. And in the midst of his ability to commit horrendous violence at the same time. So, to me, I saw that Achilles is a person sort of caught between worlds. He's caught between the world of the gods, the epic world, the world of fates and warfare and kleos and, great deeds, and then the war of his humanity and his human connections. And to me, Patroclus represented his connection to the human in all its, I think, positive sense, the humane as well as the human. So, and I think Patroclus is also, the two of them are in their own way very sort of, they're outliers. And I think as outliers, they sort of find each other and they form a bond. I also think that the friendships that are forged in childhood, people who grow up together, that can be a very, very special friendship. Sometimes it can go the opposite way. You can grow up together and then completely break apart. And you find out when you grow up, you have nothing in common. But I think when that doesn't happen, there can be this really special thing of sort of coming of age with someone. And so that was part of the relationship. And I saw in a way see Patroclus sort of becoming Achilles' conscience through the course of this, and becoming his anchor and his touchstone and kind of everything he's standing on. And he doesn't really always realize that, but when it's taken away, we see what happens to him.
The nature of the relationship is something that's really been debated for centuries. I know even the ancient Greeks and people during the classical age were talking about, well, what was their relationship? Were they really good friends? Were they lovers? What were the thoughts of these people in ancient times on Achilles and Patroclus that guided your research and your writing on their relationship, and how has their narrative changed over time?
Sure. So, as you say, there were many, many different traditions that existed in the ancient world about whether or not, they were together romantically, or whether or not they were the closest of friends, or sort of what that relationship looked like. So one of the things that drew me into their story is that I felt that in the modern world, the interpretation of them as lovers had really kind of fallen away, or wasn't being talked about, at least not in my classes or in the commentaries I was reading. Sometimes you would see it as a footnote, sometimes you would see it as sort of this coy side reference, but basically it wasn't there. And it wasn't until I started reading, the Symposium and Plato that I was like, oh, all these people thought that they were together. They looked at the Iliad, and Plato sees them as being not just lovers, but ideal lovers. And so that was very interesting to me. And I started to read the Iliad in that context. And it, I think both interpretations obviously are valid. We're never going to know what Homer intended, because was Homer even one person? We don't even know that. That the Iliad and the Odyssey came out of oral tradition, and Homer was the name that the ancients gave for whoever was the sculptor of these works. But it could have passed through many hands, and even before it passed through, whoever was the final performer, it came through oral tradition, through centuries of people telling and retelling these stories. And so, we'll never get to an answer about what was intended, what was implied in their relationship. And I've heard people argue that in the Iliad, Homer never tells us that they're lovers, so obviously they aren't. And I've heard people argue Homer never tells us that they're lovers because it would have been obvious to an ancient audience that they were. Again, we'll never get to the bottom of that, but I think both those interpretations kind of sit there, and the fact that later authors saw them that way, prove that. So I started to read the Iliad thinking about that, and what I really saw in Achilles' grief for Patroclus is how intensely physical that grief is, that he holds Patroclus's body all night long. He grieves over it. He can't let the body go. He wants their ashes mingled in an urn. So to me, that was the reading that became, as a scholar, I would always acknowledge both. But as a novelist, that was the reading that really took over for me, and felt like the resonant reading, and was sort of the reading I wanted to make a case for. Now, what's interesting is that even within the ancient world, when we have Plato talking about them, one of the things that was funny is that, Homer, the Iliad was composed sometime around 750 BCE. That date is, sometimes goes 50 years one way or another. Then we have Plato writing about it, centuries later, and Plato is saying, well, I'm interpreting this through kind of my Athenian aristocratic way of looking at two men together. So I'm going to sort of try and fit Achilles and Patroclus into this older man, younger, beautiful man category. And then you have people arguing about, well, obviously Achilles is the older one because he's the more powerful one. But wait a minute, Homer tells us that Achilles is the most beautiful one, so he has to be the younger one. But wait, and sort of, so I think it's interesting that even in the ancient world, people were trying to kind of argue about this and fit it into some sort of paradigm. And I kind of wanted to break those paradigms open. I didn't want to follow, the kind of Athenian aristocratic model. I wanted to sort of take these as two people, which is why I have them a little bit closer in age than the Iliad does.
So this past Sunday, to move a little bit away from the nature of the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles, this past Sunday was Mother's Day. And one thing that I think any Greek and anybody reading Greek myths knows is that they're all stories are filled with very strong and influential mothers who help guide the stories. And Achilles' mother, Thetis, is undoubtedly one of those strong Greek mothers. She's also an immortal nymph, which takes it to another level. Can you talk about her and elaborate on her role in Achilles' life and in his relationships?
Sure. So, she is an antagonist for a lot of the novel, but I never saw her as a villain. I saw her as actually an incredibly sympathetic person. Now, Patroclus is terrified of her in my novel because she's a goddess, and I make her a little more hostile towards him than she is in the Iliad. But she is this figure where she has a prophecy surrounding her that whoever her son is will be greater than his father. And initially, she was possibly going to be with Zeus or another major god. They were thinking of claiming her. But as soon as that prophecy is known, immediately the gods get together and they say, we have to give her to a human. We don't want this child to be too powerful. And so I feel like that's such an interesting dynamic about her, that she has been given away to a human because her blood is too strong. She's going to produce this child that is, going to have all this power and potency. And then the part of her story that I find most, overwhelming and moving is the choice that Achilles has to make. And this sort of goes into his kind of being caught between two worlds. That Achilles has to make this choice that he can live a long and happy life and no one will ever remember his name, or he can die young and be famous forever. And he chooses to die young and be famous forever. And so his mother has to go through his life with him, supporting him, knowing that he's going to die. Of course, he's human. He's going to die before her anyway, but that he's going to die so young. And she's going to just barely have him before she loses him. And in the Aeneid, we hear Priam say, that the most horrifying thing that a parent can witness is their child's death. And that is what Thetis has barreling down on her, the knowledge of her son's death with her every moment, and sort of the clock ticking and ticking and ticking. And to me, that is just, and yet she never gives up on him. She continues to try and help him sort of every step of the way. And I found that so moving. She's very fierce. And even though she's a nymph, which means she doesn't have a lot of power, she leverages all the power she possibly can. She goes to Zeus and convinces Zeus, and she goes to Hephaestus to get him armor. And she really is, sometimes people make fun of Achilles because in, the first book of the Iliad, Agamemnon insults him and he literally goes and cries to his mother. But when you have a mother like Thetis, I feel like their connection is so strong, and you can see that, the strength between them and the fierceness of that love.
Yeah, there's a great scene in the book and in Greek mythology where Achilles is hiding out on a Greek island, and the Greeks are looking for him. They're like, we need Achilles to beat the Trojans. And Odysseus ends up on the island, and obviously he pulls out all the tricks to uncover Achilles. And after finding him, he tries to convince him that, he should travel with the Greeks to Troy. And we see that his mother steps in and intervenes, like you mentioned, and warns him, if you go to Troy, you will never return. And that's a very powerful moment, because in the next pages, Achilles makes the decision with Patroclus and says, I'm going to Troy. Can you talk about the role of fate in ancient myth, and particularly in the story of Achilles as you write it?
Sure. Well, I think, fate is in a sense, the way I was looking at it, sort of the choices that we make. And again, it goes to the split between the human side and the divine side, that in a sense, the choice that Achilles is being asked to make is the choice between an epic life and sort of a private lyric life, a life of, it's sort of like he's choosing between Homer and Sappho, or, Homer and Catullus, Virgil and Catullus. And I found that, that's the type of choice that I think people do actually make in real life. We don't have a giant goddess coming down to tell us this, but people shape their lives around those types of choices. Who do I want to be? What things do I value? Is fame more important to me, or is connection to my family and sort of quiet domesticity? Which of these are more important? And the thing that I think really spoke to me is that at the end of Achilles' journey, we actually see him again in the Odyssey, because Odysseus, thanks to Circe, calls the spirits forth from the dead in the Odyssey, and he sees Achilles and Patroclus down there. And he says to Achilles, here you are, you're king of the dead. You have everything you wanted. You're the most famous Greek hero. You must be happy. And Achilles basically says, no, I made the wrong choice. It's better to be alive and to be nothing, than to be a serf, basically, than to be king of the dead. And so that moment was with me, too, as I was thinking about him choosing between those two fates, is that I wanted him to make a choice that then he regrets. If we see him in the underworld, that we would see the Achilles of the Odyssey who would say, I reversed this.
So there's a couple of there's a debate actually raging in our comments right now that I think we should address.
Yeah.
But one of our listeners asks, why did you decide to not include Achilles' invincibility? One of her favorite parts of the book is when Apollo says, just shoot Achilles because he's human and it will kill him. And obviously she thinks that it's a great choice, Elizabeth. But is wondering what led you to it. And the debate that's going on is, whether Thetis, Achilles' mother, took him to the river Styx to hold him by the heel, and the whole invincibility of Achilles, and how did that come about? So if you could settle that question and that debate, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So, obviously with a character, particularly like Achilles, there are so many versions of his story out there, just endless iterations. And so I had to kind of find a way to navigate that. So what I decided to do is that if there was doubt, or if I was unsure, I would always go back to Homer, that Homer was my guiding touchstone. And in Homer, the whole heel thing isn't mentioned and doesn't seem to exist at all. Achilles is just a incredibly powerful warrior, but he doesn't have that invulnerability. Our first version of that story, although it seems to clearly have existed before that, comes from a Roman source. So, that was a story that came in much later, although it became the most common and most popular version of his story. And I didn't, aside from the fact that I wanted to always go with Homer as my kind of primary guide, it also didn't speak to me for sort of two reasons. One was that to me, it had never made sense that a mother, we were just talking about Thetis and how careful she is as a mother. It never made sense to me that Thetis would dip him by the heel and then not switch hands and dip him again. I feel like any good mom would do that. She would be on top of that. So sort of locating his vulnerability with his mother's negligence felt really annoying to me, honestly. And, and also unrealistic. So I didn't want to go with it for that reason. But also, I sort of like the idea that that was the type of story that would naturally grow up around someone like Achilles, someone whose abilities were so incredible that they almost seemed magical. And people would start to say, well, yeah, I didn't kill him when I fought him today, but that's because he can only be killed in that one spot. That's why I didn't get him. And so this sort of that those are the types of stories we start to tell ourselves about people who have these extraordinary capacities, is that they're magical almost. And so I like the idea that, if we checked in on the Achilles myth 500 years later, suddenly we have this whole myth about how he's invulnerable everywhere except for this one spot on his heel. So I liked that as well. I will add that I had one reader come up to me after an event who was a podiatrist. and said that, interestingly enough, foot wounds were actually incredibly dangerous in the ancient world because there was such a high risk of infection. And so whether or not that is also playing into, obviously it's your feet, it's on the ground, it's constantly getting dust and stuff into it. And so oftentimes people could die of foot wounds. It just wouldn't be right away. It would be from, gangrene and infection later on. So whether or not that also plays into the myth, I thought that was really neat.
That's great. So I hope that settles some of the questions that we're seeing in the comments. And thanks for providing such a great answer. There's another question that we got from Mariana, who wants to ask about the relationship between Thetis and Patroclus. It's one that you touched on a little bit, but can you explore the evolution of that relationship? For Mariana, it amazed her that the way that you represented grief as the way that they set their differences aside, per se, and came together to remember and relive their greatest memories of Achilles at the end of the book.
I think that Thetis I talked a little bit about sort of some of Thetis's life, but I also see her life as really a tragedy, that she is forced to, it depends on the version of the myth, but in many versions, she is forced to marry Peleus, Achilles' father, unwillingly. And she is sort of shackled to this mortal life. Oftentimes their first encounter is actually a rape. And so her feelings towards mortals would be, I imagined, if we're thinking about this psychologically, extremely hostile. It is mortality that, has taken her against her will in this marriage. It is mortality that is going to kill her child. And so I saw her, taking a lot of that out on Patroclus, that to her, he represents a male mortal, and she has a lot of anger about that. And the gods are not particularly, they don't have a high emotional intelligence. They're very extreme, and that's what's really interesting to me about the gods is that they're often less wise than humans are. And so, I wanted her to have this kind of hostility towards Patroclus as the symbol of mortality, as the symbol of the thing that is killing her child and that has, taken over her life, and pulled her out of her other life. So, and I obviously, I think Patroclus sees her the same way, that, Achilles' desire for fame and this kind of immortal life after is what's killing him. So they both sort of think that, the other one is what's killing Achilles. But they come to realize that actually, they don't have to be on opposite sides, and that they, through their love for Achilles, they can join that love together. And that was always where I was going. I had that ending in mind from the very first scene I wrote between the two of them. Because I think one of the things that I love about Thetis is that she, although most gods cannot change, Thetis is able to change a little bit because of her intense love and commitment to her child. And because she's pretty extraordinary in her own right. And so she is able to sort of find a way through this indomitable, rage and monolithic personality that the gods have to a place that is closer to humanity. And she and Patroclus can kind of meet in that place.
And I thought those last pages were great. When you're reading them and you see that reconciliation, I think that was one of the great ways that the book wraps up and brings their relationship to a final resting place for Achilles and Patroclus, but also reconciles Patroclus with Achilles' mother, which is his he kind of has a fear for her, which you see it throughout the book. There's another character that we haven't touched on at all, and I think his role in developing the person of who Achilles is and who Patroclus is instrumental, and that person is Hieron, the centaur educator of Achilles and Patroclus in their youth. Mariana has a follow-up question on Hieron, so I'm going to pop it up on the screen for our listeners. Could you develop a little bit the way that Hieron shaped that relationship between Achilles and Patroclus and the connection it may have with the questioning of fate? And my question follow-up too is, how instrumental is Hieron in developing Achilles into the man that he is going to be, and the same for Patroclus?
Yeah. Well, before I get to him, and I'm going to apologize because I often say Chiron, so okay. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I mean, I often switch back and forth between Patroclus and Patroclus. So again, my apologies. I had teachers who taught me both ways, and so therefore I'm constantly toggling back and forth. Um, but I want to say one more thing about Patroclus and Thetis, actually, just before I move
Hmm.
on to my favorite centaur, which is that I think that Patroclus, although he is a person of great empathy and great understanding and great sympathy for others, I think that on some level that sympathy has not extended to Thetis for most of their relationship. That because she is a goddess, he sort of doesn't think of her as a personality, as someone who feels pain. He just sees her as angry. And I think that partially what has to happen is she has to bend towards him, but he has to bend towards her and realize that she has this incredibly tragic story, and that she has such a huge claim to grief in her own life, and so much pain that she is struggling with. And so I feel like it really they both have to reach out. It isn't just her that has to change. He has to acknowledge, her personhood. So anyway, sorry. Going back to Huron,
Our
um,
favorite centaur.
our favorite centaur. So when you are writing a novel about these ancient myths, I feel like that there is this fork in the road that comes really early on, which is, are there going to be gods and monsters in this novel, or are they going to be metaphorical? That the characters in the novel believe in them, but they aren't really there. And I knew right from the beginning I wanted the gods and monsters in because they're in Homer, and Homer was always my primary source. But that doesn't mean that when I got to the day when I had to write the scene with, the centaur in it, that I didn't flinch a little bit. I thought, how can I make this realistic? I don't want this to be absurd. I don't want this to be farcical or cartoonish. I want this to be a real character. And when I finally got to the scene, I actually had no problems with it at all, despite having worried about it for a long time, because the character of Chiron just sort of was there. The idea of this incredibly wise, incredibly benevolent, deep thinking, kind person kind of was just waiting for me. Now, no one in my novel is based on any person in real life. I don't write that way. But I would say that Huron is my homage to great teachers. And I think that teachers can really change people's lives and can shape them forever, and set them on a different path. And so in him, I kind of saw this figure of the great teacher. What would this amazing, kind teacher who is always trying to do the right thing for you, who is always trying to nudge you towards greater wisdom and deeper thinking and better understanding? So I absolutely think he was incredibly influential in their story, and in a way, I think the novel couldn't exist without him, because he represents this sort of ability for Patroclus and Achilles to think outside the narrow confines of, this is what you do, and then you get a lot of gold, and you have to make a good alliance, and you have to, have honor in war, and all of this stuff that sort of is the typical Mycenaean, um, princely life. But for me, Huron was always looking outside. Let's study the stars. Let's study healing. Let's look at what actually it means to be in a society and what countries are. And so I saw him as sort of, there's this wonderful tradition in ancient Greece, obviously, of the philosopher. And so I sort of saw him as the natural philosopher, who doesn't really exist in Homer, but certainly exists in ancient Greek history and literature.
And we see educators like that in different Greek myths as well. I think Jason is taught by Huron as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yes.
So the Odyssey and the Iliad, both of Homer's works, were incredibly popular for the Greeks and the Romans in the classical age and beyond. We see obviously like Alexander the Great had a copy of the Iliad with him at all times. The Romans studied Homer. The Byzantines continued that tradition and studied Homer next to the Bible and the religious works. And obviously into the Enlightenment and modern history and today, we see these classics playing a very important role in our education. how would you say that the Homer's works influenced classical culture in ancient Greece and codes of conduct and behavior? And would you say that they put Homer's work on the same pedestal that we, in like the Western world, for example, have the Bible?
Sure. I mean, I think people were constantly, from the moment that the Iliad and the Odyssey existed, I think people were constantly sort of wrestling with them, reinterpreting them, arguing with them, digging into them in deeper ways. I mean, so many of the tragedies that we have come right out of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and sort of enlarging on Homer's world, enlarging on some of these characters. And I love how there's sort of arguments about these characters, that, the Odyssey represents Odysseus as a mostly positive figure, not entirely positive, but mostly positive. And yet when you see Odysseus in tragedy, you have, Sophocles, for instance, weighing in and giving us an Odysseus that is pretty villainous. And so I love that, that this conversation about these characters and about how we should read them was ongoing in the ancient world. And I think it makes it so rich. And there were all kinds of authors who were adding in their voices. I love Virgil, Virgil's Aeneid. I mean, Virgil was such a deep lover of Homer, was so steeped in it, and sort of said, well, now I'm going to write the Roman Iliad and Odyssey. And reading, the Aeneid is so many things, but it is such a deep love letter to Homer, as well as sort of, again, turning that on its head, saying, okay, I think in some ways Virgil is picking up on the idea that, who are the real heroes of the Iliad? In many ways, it's not Achilles or Odysseus or Ajax, it's Hector. Hector is probably the most outright heroic figure in the Iliad. And so here you have Virgil picking up on that and saying, yes, and all those Trojans became Romans. Very self-serving, but also, in interacting with those myths. So, I mean, I think it's bedrock. It's bedrock for so much, and each thing built on the next thing, just as the tragedians were building on Homer, then you have, Ovid and Virgil building on them, and then you have so many later authors just building and building all the way through, Shakespeare and James Joyce and Margaret Atwood and Eudora Welty and, everyone sort of interpreting and reinterpreting these characters. So I think it's just such a testament to how incredibly rich and varied these characters and this world is.
So we have a follow-up question on Huron, and I think it's a great question. So I'm going to bring it into the screen so we can see it, and I'll read it to you. So it's from Greg, who asks, if you have time to expand on Huron, do you think he was sad when he sent Achilles the spear as a gift? Because you wrote that Patroclus acknowledges it as kind of a permission for Achilles to fight. But Greg wonders if Huron sent the gift of a spear with a heavy heart. And kind of tell our listeners a little bit maybe too about that moment in the book.
Yes. So Achilles and Patroclus leave Huron's cave and his teaching sort of abruptly, and they get immediately pulled into the Trojan War, which is breaking out, and they don't ever really get to go back. And then Huron sends this spear to Achilles. And I absolutely imagined it as a very bittersweet moment for, imagining. But I in a way, I think that I saw that as part of this sadness that Huron carries, which is that he can teach his, students all that he can, but he cannot choose for them. And, so then he has a choice of, do I support them in what they are doing? Do I try and send a piece of me so that even as they're carrying this spear that has all this death and pain attached to it, they think of me, and hopefully that mitigates it in some way. So I definitely saw that as a very complicated gift, and certainly one that would have not been made with uncomplicated feelings.
So as we're getting close to, I think, wrapping up our conversation, we've got time for a couple more questions. And this one is from Daniela, who asks, and I think most of our listeners will be interested in this answer. But what books would you recommend for somebody who just got started with Greek mythology by reading the Song of Achilles and wants to complement and better understand their reading of the Iliad?
Mm, mm. I mean, there are a lot of books out there that are interacting with the Iliad in lots of different ways. There is David Malouf wrote Ransom, which just takes, speaking of how rich and varied this world is, it just takes the episode between Achilles and Priam, where he gives the body of Hector back to Priam, the king of Troy, and that episode is the whole novel. So, I think that's very interesting. Obviously, reading the Iliad, although I would tweak that a little bit and say, don't read the Iliad, listen to the Iliad. We talked a little bit about how, oral tradition and songs and these were originally performed before an audience. And I think the Iliad in particular really suffers on the page. I think that when you hear someone reading it, all those names, like in book 2, that huge long list of ships in book 2, which can really bog people down, I think they go by just the way they're supposed to go by, where you don't sort of end up on the page like, do I need to be remembering this? So I would highly recommend the audiobook of the Iliad, and there's some great ones out there. I think there's even one by Derek Jacobi that I would recommend. So definitely listening on audiobook to the Iliad. I would highly recommend Emily Wilson's Odyssey, which I think talks a lot about sort of how the Odyssey came out of the Iliad. You can read both. Her translation of the Odyssey is excellent, but also her foreword is really informative just about Homer and sort of the world in general. Let's see. What else? I mean, I think reading translations of some of the tragedies that retell stories from this are really, really interesting. And there are a lot of books out there that are retellings of individual character points of view. There's one by Krista Wolf called Cassandra. There are a lot out there about Helen. There's a nonfiction book about Helen by the UK classicist Bettany Hughes. So yeah, I mean, it's such a wealth, but I would say, start by listening to the Iliad on audiobook and just knowing, yes, there are a lot of names, but let them go by. Let them go by.
So you obviously chose to write about Achilles and Patroclus and Song of Achilles and then Circe in your next book. But is there a character that, aside from those, that really stands out to you in the Iliad?
Any other characters?
Any other character, yeah.
I have a secret. Yes, many. So Hector and Andromache, I love both of those characters. On the Trojan side, I find Andromache really moving and interesting as a character. The character of Briseis, who I was really a pillar of the Song of Achilles for me. She was one of the most important kind of, I felt like she was holding up the novel in some ways, at least the second half of the novel. And I've always really liked Diomedes. Liked is the wrong word. I have always really enjoyed the character of Diomedes, and obviously had fun writing him in Song of Achilles.
Yeah, Diomedes is actually a favorite of mine too. He happens to be the king of the city that my dad is from in Greece. So
there you go.
I kind of have to pick him. But I want to wrap up with one last question and give us a little promo of what's coming up for Madeline Miller. I know we talked about it in our last interview, but it's always great to have that for current listeners. There might be new ones that are following along. And we'd love to hear what developments have happened since then and what we should be expecting. And obviously, as one of the things that did happen between this event and our previous one was the paperback edition of Circe being released. But give us some insight into what's coming up.
So there is going to be, hopefully, an HBO Max miniseries of Circe. Related to Song of Achilles, I'm really, really hoping to see Song of Achilles on the stage. So I'm working hard to make that happen. I have always thought that I would love to see that. I have a theater background, and just Song of Achilles feels like that's its perfect medium. I mean, I'd love to see it in other forms too, but for me, I'm really right now focused on Song of Achilles and the stage. I'm thinking about working on a novel that is inspired by the Aeneid. So that's sort of my other great ancient epic. But I'm also working on a short story about Pandora right now, who is a figure that I have always found very interesting. And finally, I'm working on a novel. I'm not really doing all this at the same time, especially not right now. But I'm also thinking about a novel inspired by the Tempest, which is sort of the other thing I do. I mentioned theater, but I direct Shakespeare plays. And in fact, Shakespeare, I think, gave me this key piece of Patroclus's character in Troilus and Cressida. Oh, I can't believe I didn't mention that. You must read Troilus and Cressida if you're interested in the Iliad. It's Shakespeare's version of the Iliad, and it's him sort of taking on all these characters. It's very kind of bitter and nasty and funny and snide and snarky. So it's a very interesting tone. But a lot of fun to read. But he has this one line where he has sort of a beautiful moment between, or this one scene where he has a beautiful moment between Achilles and Patroclus, where Achilles says, blames himself for being the reason that Achilles isn't fighting, and therefore the reason that the Greeks don't respect him anymore. And Patroclus talks about his little stomach to the war, that he doesn't actually want to fight very much. Which is Shakespeare innovating that. Shakespeare didn't really he'd only read little bits in translation of the Iliad, if that. Mostly it was coming down to him in other versions. So he wasn't working from the Iliad as a primary source. So he invented that, but I ended up using it a little bit. To me, that connected. So Shakespeare has really been at the bedrock of this all along. And the Tempest is what I'm thinking about next.
Well, we're very excited for all of these developments. We'll be keeping an eye out for anything new that comes out under your name, and we'll be sure to share it around. If you haven't picked up Song of Achilles or Circe, we highly recommend it. Make sure to check it out at your library or Amazon or any local bookshops, because they need a lot of support now, especially during this pandemic. And Song of Achilles right there if you need a look at what the cover looks like. But Madeline, thank you again for joining us. It's been great having you with us. I love the conversation, and I know our audience has been really thrilled to hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
And stay tuned for a number of our other events. We will be posting them on our Facebook event page. We'll be sending out emails. We've got an event next week commemorating the Pandian Greek genocide on May 19th. And we've got a couple other events the following week, another book club event on the book The League of Wives. And we'll be talking to Roger Crowley on May 29th about his book 1453 and the Fall of Constantinople. Thank you all again for joining. That wraps up our discussion.